3 days from now, on June 1st, the Atlantic hurricane season officially begins. But the ocean does not wait for official dates. It has been building energy for months, and what scientists are measuring in the Gulf of Mexico right now is not normal. It is not even close to normal. The water is so warm, so deep with stored heat, that researchers at Yale Climate Connections are using the word startling to describe it. Not concerning, not elevated, startling. Welcome to Sky Space Lab. I am Arthur. This channel is very new, and every like and subscription truly helps us grow and bring you even deeper, more powerful research. Thank you in advance for every like and follow. What you're about to hear is not a seasonal weather update. It is a picture of an ocean that has been fundamentally transformed, arriving at the doorstep of a hurricane season with conditions that have broken records 3 years in a row. And as that season opens in 72 hours, the agencies responsible for protecting tens of millions of Americans are entering it with fewer staff, less funding, and more open questions than at any point in recent memory. The combination of what is happening beneath the surface of the Gulf and what is happening inside the institutions meant to protect us creates a situation that demands attention right now, before the first storm is even named. Let us start with the water itself, because nothing else makes sense without understanding it. The Gulf of Mexico is one of the most important bodies of water on the planet when it comes to hurricanes. It sits like a warm bathtub just south of the most densely populated stretches of the American coastline, from Texas all the way around to Florida and up through the Carolinas. When a tropical storm enters the Gulf, what it finds waiting for it determines whether it arrives on shore as a nuisance or as a catastrophe. And what is waiting for storms in the Gulf of Mexico right now is unprecedented. As of mid-May 2026, sea surface temperatures in the Gulf are tied with the same date in 2024 as the warmest ever recorded, running more than 1 degree Celsius above the 1991 to 2020 long-term average. That may sound like a small number, but in the physics of hurricane formation, 1 degree Celsius is enormous. Research shows that hurricane potential intensity increases by roughly 5 to 7% for every single degree of warming. That means that any storm crossing these waters this season carries with it a built-in intensification advantage that simply did not exist a generation ago. But the surface temperature is only the beginning of the story. What makes the Gulf so uniquely dangerous right now is not just how warm the water is at the top, it is how deep that warmth goes. When a hurricane passes over the ocean, its massive spinning winds churn the water beneath it. In normal conditions, this churning brings cold water up from the depths, cooling the surface and slowing the storm down. This process is one of nature's natural brakes on hurricane intensity. But when warm water extends hundreds of feet below the surface, there is no cold water left to bring up. The hurricane's winds simply stir up more warm water, and the storm continues to feed and strengthen without interruption. This is the phenomenon scientists call ocean heat content, and it is why some storms that look manageable on satellite imagery suddenly explode into monsters hours before making landfall. Right now, the ocean heat content in the Gulf is at near record levels. Researchers at the University of Miami have been tracking this data since 2013, and the curve they are looking at today rises sharply in a way that has no precedent in the historical record. The warm water does not just sit near the surface. It extends to depths of 100 meters or more across large portions of the Gulf Basin, creating what scientists call a reservoir of energy that any sufficiently organized storm could tap into with devastating efficiency. And there is one more piece of this puzzle that scientists are watching with particular urgency. It is called the loop current. The loop current is a powerful river of warm tropical water that flows northward through the Yucatan Channel between Cuba and Mexico, loops out into the Gulf of Mexico, then curves back southward past the Florida Keys, and eventually joins the Gulf Stream along the eastern seaboard. It is essentially a pipeline that continuously pumps warm Caribbean water deep into the Gulf, and periodically this current sheds a ring, a clockwise spinning eddy of warm water that breaks off and drifts slowly westward across the Gulf, sometimes sitting in place for months. When Hurricane Katrina crossed the Gulf in August of 2005, it passed directly over one of these loop current eddies. In the hours that followed, Katrina intensified from a Category 3 storm to a Category 5, reaching winds of 175 miles per hour. 3 weeks later, Hurricane Rita crossed the same eddy and underwent the same explosive deepening. Both storms became among the most destructive in American history. The eddy had not moved. It was still there, waiting. Right now, in late May 2026, the loop current has just shed a ring. Scientists at Yale Climate Connections report that the current released an eddy in February, and it is already in a regrowth phase, extending northward again. That means by the peak of hurricane season, which typically runs from mid-August through October, the loop current will likely be positioned to release another eddy, placing a massive pocket of deep warm water squarely in the path of any storm that tracks across the Gulf. This is not speculation. This is what the current data shows, and researchers are stating it directly in their published analyses right now. Here is where things become worth pausing on for a moment. All of these measurements, the record surface temperatures, the extraordinary ocean heat content, the loop current behavior, come from verified scientific sources published in the past 2 weeks. The pattern they describe is real, and it has been building for more than a decade. Since 2012, summertime sea surface temperatures in the Gulf have been rising at roughly twice the rate recorded across global oceans. Record highs were set in 2024, and then again in 2025. And as this season opens, the Gulf has entered it tied for the warmest it has ever been this early in the year. As always, I encourage you to look at these datasets directly, to read the published research, and to form your own informed view of what these numbers mean for the months ahead. Now, one thing that forecasters want to be careful about is the distinction between warm water and storm count. NOAA's official 2026 forecast, released just 6 days ago, predicts a below-normal season in terms of the number of storms, calling for 8 to 14 named storms with 3 to 6 reaching hurricane strength. The primary reason for that moderated forecast is El Niño. El Niño is a climate pattern characterized by warmer-than-average water temperatures across the equatorial Pacific Ocean, and it tends to suppress Atlantic hurricane activity by increasing what forecasters call wind shear, essentially creating atmospheric turbulence that disrupts the organized circulation that storms need to form and intensify. But here is the critical caveat that every expert is emphasizing right now, and it cannot be stated clearly enough. A below-average storm count does not mean a low-risk season. It never has. Hurricane Andrew formed in 1992, an El Niño year, as just the first named storm of August. There was almost nothing happening in the Atlantic that summer. Andrew rapidly intensified near Miami and became one of the most destructive storms in American history, causing damage that in today's dollars would exceed $50 billion. It only takes one storm to cross the wrong stretch of ocean at the wrong moment to produce a catastrophe. AccuWeather lead hurricane expert Alex De Silva put it plainly in a forecast released this week. The Atlantic waters are warm enough to allow storms to intensify quickly, including before the season officially begins on June 1st. The warm water, he noted, is not just at the surface. It extends exceptionally deep across most of the hurricane basin. That is why, despite the suppressive influence of El Niño, rapid intensification remains the primary concern heading into this season. Rapid intensification is defined as a storm strengthening by at least 35 miles per hour in wind speed within a 24-hour period. It is the most dangerous behavior a hurricane can display because it compresses the window of time that coastal residents have to prepare and evacuate. A storm that is a Category 1 on Monday morning can be a Category 4 by Tuesday evening. The Gulf, right now, has the fuel to make that happen. 5 of the 10 continental United States landfalling storms that strengthened by at least 40 miles per hour in the day before landfall have occurred in the past 9 years alone. That is not a statistical coincidence. That is a direct reflection of what has been happening to Gulf temperatures since 2012. Hurricane Helene in 2024 drew strength from unusually warm Gulf waters as it bore down on Florida's coast, undergoing rapid intensification in its final hours before making landfall. The data from that storm, analysed alongside the current ocean conditions, tells scientists that what happened with Helene is not a one-time event. It is the new baseline. The highest risk areas identified by AccuWeather for direct storm impacts this season are the northern and northeastern Gulf Coast, stretching from the Florida Panhandle through Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana, and the Carolinas along the Atlantic seaboard. Colorado State University, which pioneered the science of seasonal hurricane forecasting back in 1984, has independently identified a trajectory for this season, similar to the years 2006, 2009, 2015, and 2023. In those analog years, storms consistently tracked toward the Gulf Coast and the Carolinas, rather than curving harmlessly out to sea. There is also a disturbance worth watching right now, this week. Meteorologists at AccuWeather are monitoring a tropical area of interest that may develop in the Western Caribbean or Gulf and track toward the Eastern Gulf and the southern Atlantic coast of the United States from this final weekend of May into early June. Regardless of whether it develops into a named storm, forecasters say that heavy rainfall will affect parts of the south central and southeastern United States this week. Florida, southern Georgia, coastal Alabama, coastal Mississippi, and southeastern Louisiana are all in the zone for rainfall totals between 2 and 4 inches. The risk of localized flash flooding stretches as far north as North Carolina. This is the world that hurricane season is opening into, a Gulf that has warmed at twice the global rate for over a decade. Surface temperatures tied for the warmest ever recorded at this point in the year. Ocean heat content near record levels at depths that would allow rapid intensification to occur without natural breaking. A loop current preparing to shed another warm eddy directly in the path of any storm that crosses the Gulf during peak season. A tropical disturbance already forming this week as the official start date arrives. But there is a second dimension to this story that is just as important as the ocean temperatures, and in some ways even more urgent. Because a dangerous hurricane season is one thing. A dangerous hurricane season arriving when the agencies responsible for responding to it have been significantly weakened is something else entirely. FEMA enters the 2026 Atlantic hurricane season in a state that several members of Congress and emergency management experts are openly describing as less prepared than it has been in a generation. Since January 2025, more than 5,000 employees have departed the agency, according to a letter from congressional oversight officials. That represents a workforce reduction of approximately 14%. A proposed budget cut of $646 million for fiscal year 2026 was put forward earlier this year, along with cancellations of billions of dollars in disaster preparedness grants that help states build resilience before storms arrive. Hurricane readiness trainings for state and local emergency managers were cancelled. The Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program, which funded projects like flood mitigation systems in coastal cities, was eliminated entirely. A 76-day government shutdown that stretched through most of early 2026 cut off FEMA's annual appropriations until the DHS funding bill finally passed on April 30th. While that bill did replenish the Disaster Relief Fund with $26.4 billion and rejected further staffing cuts, officials acknowledged that the damage from the shutdown will take months to address. FEMA is currently managing more than 300,000 open projects across more than 600 active disaster declarations, all with a staff that is roughly 14% smaller than it was 16 months ago. 14 FEMA employees who signed a public letter of dissent last August, warning about the agency's declining capacity to respond to disasters, were placed on paid administrative leave for 8 months. They were only reinstated in May of 2026, weeks before hurricane season begins. The fact that staff members felt compelled to issue a public warning and were then removed from their duties for doing so gives some indication of the internal pressure that has been building inside the agency. At the National Weather Service, which provides the forecasts and warnings that FEMA and local emergency managers depend on to make life or death decisions, approximately 600 employees have left through layoffs or buyouts, representing roughly 15% of its total workforce. A reduction in the launches of weather balloons caused by staffing cuts has already produced a measurable decline in the accuracy of US weather models in recent weeks, according to a former National Weather Service chief. These balloons are not optional equipment. They are essential to producing the atmospheric profiles that allow forecasters to accurately predict where a storm is heading and how intense it will be when it gets there. When that data is incomplete, the forecast degrades. When the forecast degrades, the warning comes later, and when the warning comes later, people have less time to act. The National Flood Insurance Program, which protects millions of homeowners in flood-prone coastal regions, is currently operating under severe limitations according to DHS officials, delaying policy renewals and disrupting real estate markets in exactly the communities that face the highest hurricane risk. For families in those communities, the question of whether their home is insured against storm surge or flooding is not abstract. It is the difference between financial recovery and financial ruin. This is the full picture as hurricane season opens in 3 days, an ocean running at near-record warmth with conditions scientifically documented to favour rapid intensification, a loop current preparing to place another eddy of superheated deep water in the path of whatever storms this season produces, a tropical disturbance already developing this week off the southeastern coast, and the institutions designed to warn, protect and rebuild after storms hitting this season with smaller staffs, reduced budgets, cancelled training programs, and months of shutdown damage still being worked through. NOAA's lead hurricane forecaster, Matthew Rosenkrantz, noted at the press conference announcing this season's outlook that the Gulf of Mexico is abnormally warm as it was last year. He was choosing his words carefully, as scientists do, but the data behind those words is not careful. It is stark. The Gulf has been warming at twice the global rate for over a decade. The warm water now extends deeper than it ever has at this point in the year, and the loop current is already positioning itself for another release. It only takes one storm. That phrase appears in nearly every forecast document released this week by AccuWeather, NOAA, and Colorado State University. It is not a rhetorical device. It is a statement of statistical reality. Quiet seasons produce catastrophes. El Niño years produce disasters. A below-average storm count does not mean below-average danger. It means that the danger is concentrated into whatever storms do form, and those storms, if they find the Gulf in its current condition, will find more fuel waiting for them than almost any storm in recorded history has encountered. The coming months will determine what this season becomes. But the conditions that will shape it are already in place, already measurable, already documented. The ocean does not wait for the calendar. It has been warming since 2012 at a rate that has outpaced every projection, every model run, every historical precedent. And as of this week, 3 days before the official start of a new season, it is warmer than it has almost ever been at this moment in the year. What happens next is not yet written. But what is already written in the temperature records, in the ocean heat content measurements, in the loop current data, in the staffing numbers and the budget documents, is a story that demands attention from every person living within reach of a Gulf or Atlantic coastline. The season begins June 1st. The water has been ready for months. To understand why the combination of everything described so far matters in the most immediate and personal way possible, it helps to leave the data for a moment and walk through what rapid intensification actually looks like from the ground. Not from a satellite image, not from a forecast model, from the perspective of someone standing in the path of a storm that the ocean has just decided to feed. Think about what happened in September 2024 with Hurricane Helene. On September 23rd, the system that would become Helene was little more than a disorganized cluster of thunderstorms drifting northward through the western Caribbean. 4 days later, it made landfall in Florida's Big Bend region as a Category 4 hurricane with maximum sustained winds of 140 miles per hour. In the final 18 hours before it reached shore, its wind speeds increased by approximately 50 miles per hour. A storm that had been a Category 1 hurricane became a major Category 4 in less than 1 day. NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory and scientists at Climate Central both confirmed afterward that Helene's rapid intensification occurred directly over Gulf waters that were roughly 1 degree Celsius warmer than the long-term average, and that those temperatures were made 600 to 400 times more likely to occur because of climate change. The Gulf was not just warm at the surface. The heat extended deep below, preventing the storm's churning winds from bringing up cold water to cool itself down. Helene fed without restraint, and more than 250 people died. This is the process that is now physically established as the new normal in the Gulf of Mexico, and the Gulf entering the 2026 hurricane season is as warm as it was when Helene found its fuel. The data from the University of Miami and from Yale Climate Connections makes this unambiguous. Sea surface temperatures are tied with the warmest ever recorded at this point in the year. Ocean heat content is near record levels. The loop current shed a ring in February and is regrowing northward, positioning itself to release another eddy during the peak of the season. Every one of these physical conditions that fed Helene's explosive final surge is present right now, waiting for the next storm to cross into the Gulf. And the history of what loop current eddies do to storms that cross them is not subtle. In July of 2005, the loop current shed a large eddy that drifted into the central Gulf of Mexico. On August 28th of that year, Hurricane Katrina crossed over it. In 9 hours, according to NASA data, Katrina evolved from a Category 3 storm with winds around 97 miles per hour into a Category 5 monster with winds reaching 173 miles per hour. 9 hours. The eddy did not dissipate after Katrina passed. It remained in the Gulf, slowly drifting westward. 3 weeks later, Hurricane Rita crossed the same eddy and underwent the same explosive deepening, reaching Category 5 strength. Both storms became among the top 20 most expensive weather disasters in recorded world history. The loop current eddy had not moved. It was still there, patient and full of heat, ready to feed the next storm that arrived. Scientists at the University of Miami who have spent careers studying this system have been consistent in their warnings. Dr. Nick Shea, a professor of ocean sciences at the Rosenstiel School, has spent years explaining that the correlation between loop current eddies and hurricane rapid intensification in the Gulf is not a statistical coincidence. It is a physical mechanism. When a storm passes over one of these warm core rings, the deep warm water prevents the natural cooling process that would otherwise slow the intensification. The storm's winds stir up more warm water instead of cold. The result is that the ocean, in those moments, functions as an accelerant rather than a brake. The loop current shed its most recent ring in February of 2026. As of this week, it is in a regrowth phase, extending northward again. According to scientists at Yale Climate Connections, this configuration favours the release of another eddy during the peak of hurricane season. That means that by August or September, when the atmospheric conditions most favourable to tropical development typically arrive in the Gulf, a reservoir of deep warm water will likely be sitting somewhere in the basin, waiting. Where exactly it will sit, and whether any storm will cross it, cannot be known months in advance, but the fuel will be there. Now it is important to step back here and engage honestly with the other side of this picture. Not because the risk is exaggerated, but because understanding the full complexity of what is happening is what separates genuine preparedness from panic. The El Niño developing in the tropical Pacific this season is real, it is significant, and it does provide meaningful protection. El Niño works by warming the equatorial Pacific, which triggers atmospheric changes that increase wind shear over the Atlantic and Caribbean. Wind shear is essentially turbulence in the upper atmosphere that disrupts the organized circulation a tropical storm needs to maintain and intensify. When shear is high, storms struggle to hold together, and many dissipate before they become threats. NOAA's official 2026 forecast, released on May 21st, gives a 55% chance of a below-normal Atlantic season, calling for 8 to 14 named storms with 3 to 6 reaching hurricane strength. Colorado State University, which has been making seasonal hurricane forecasts since 1984, independently arrived at similar numbers, calling for 13 named storms and 6 hurricanes. Both agencies explicitly cited the developing El Niño as the primary reason for the moderated outlook. And both agencies have been equally explicit that moderated does not mean safe. The critical question that every forecaster is focused on right now is timing. El Niño's suppressive effects do not arrive fully formed at the beginning of June. The atmospheric changes driven by Pacific warming take months to propagate around the globe and establish themselves over the Atlantic. During the early part of the season, June through much of August, the suppression may be only partial. Forecasters are watching closely to see how quickly the El Niño strengthens and when its effects become dominant over the Atlantic. If El Niño intensifies quickly and establishes strong shear early, the season may indeed be quiet. If it develops slowly, or if the shear fluctuates, then the early and middle portions of the season remain genuinely dangerous, with a Gulf that is historically warm and a loop current that is positioning for maximum energy release. There is also the possibility that this El Niño becomes what scientists are calling a super El Niño. NOAA's latest data assigns roughly a 50% chance of this event reaching strong El Niño status, and approximately a 1 in 4 chance of reaching the super El Niño threshold, where equatorial Pacific sea surface temperatures exceed 2 degrees Celsius above average for 3 consecutive months. If a super El Niño fully establishes itself by late summer, it could dramatically suppress Atlantic activity in September and October. But it could also create a different set of problems. Historically, super El Niño events have been followed by equally strong La Niña patterns in the following year. If a super El Niño peaks in late 2026 and collapses into a La Niña by 2027, the 2027 hurricane season could arrive with suppressed activity finally removed and Atlantic waters still very warm, creating conditions for an extremely active season. This is not a concern for today, but it is part of the larger picture that climate scientists are watching carefully. There is one more dimension of this story that brings the abstract atmospheric science directly back to the human level, and it is a dimension that does not receive enough attention. It involves the cities themselves and the people who live in them. A catastrophe modelling firm called Karen Clark and Company published a study concluding that Tampa Bay is the single most vulnerable place in the United States to storm surge flooding from a hurricane, with potential damage estimates reaching $175 billion. That figure was calculated before the extraordinary population growth Tampa has experienced in the years since. The metropolitan Tampa Bay area is now home to roughly 4 million people. About 50% of them live at elevations less than 10 feet above sea level. The bay's geography is almost perfectly designed from a physical standpoint to amplify storm surge. It is shallow. It is funnel-shaped. When wind pushes water towards shore, the shallowing depth forces that water upward, rather than allowing it to spread and dissipate. MIT meteorology professor Kerry Emanuel described the physics precisely when he said that a storm surge behaves like a traffic jam. The front of the wave slows as the water gets shallower, and the water behind it piles up. Tampa Bay, with its particular shape and depth profile, amplifies this effect to a degree that few other urban coastlines in America match. What makes this especially dangerous is the combination of physical vulnerability and unfamiliarity. Tampa has not taken a direct hit from a major hurricane since 1921. In that year, only a few hundred people lived in what were then sparsely developed coastal towns. When the 1921 storm struck, ocean waves broke in the middle of downtown, and large sections of infrastructure were destroyed, and the population was a tiny fraction of what it is today. The decades since have seen an enormous migration of people into the Tampa Bay area, many of whom have never experienced a major hurricane, many of whom move from inland states where hurricane culture does not exist, and many of whom may not know their flood zone designation or have a practiced evacuation plan. When Hurricane Milton threatened Tampa in October of 2024, officials issued evacuation orders for 6 counties covering almost 4 million people. The window between the order and the potential landfall was measured in hours. That experience demonstrated both the scale of what a real evacuation of this region would require and the extraordinary difficulty of executing it with the speed that a rapidly intensifying storm can demand. New Orleans presents a different but equally sobering picture. More than 50% of the city sits below sea level. The levee system rebuilt after Katrina represents a massive engineering achievement, but it is not designed for every possible scenario. The city has a 16.5% poverty rate, well above the national average, and a significant portion of its population lacks the financial resources to evacuate quickly, secure temporary housing, or recover without sustained federal assistance. When federal assistance comes from an agency that has lost more than 5,000 employees in 16 months, that is managing more than 300,000 open projects, and that just emerged from a 76-day funding shutdown, the gap between what people need and what the system can deliver becomes a very real concern. Houston, which Hurricane Beryl struck in July 2024, causing 3 million homes and businesses to lose power in the middle of a summer heatwave, adds yet another dimension to this picture. Harris County, where Houston sits, grew by 1/3 between 2000 and 2023, adding 1.3 million residents. More than 1/5 of its population is considered socially vulnerable. The rapid population growth that has made the Gulf Coast economically dynamic over the past 2 decades has also placed more people in harm's way than at any point in history. The people most exposed to the worst outcomes are often the ones with the fewest options. The elderly, the disabled, people living in poverty, mobile home residents, and those without reliable transportation cannot simply decide to leave. They depend on systems that must work effectively under pressure. Those systems are under more pressure than they have been in a generation. It is worth pausing here to note something about how we process risk. Louisiana state climatologist Jay Grimes, speaking just 10 days ago, said something that captures a pattern that scientists observe repeatedly. He noted that public memory of past disasters fades quickly, even as the objective risk has increased. People forget what happened 3 years ago, 5 years ago, 7 years ago, he said. The destruction that Helene caused across western North Carolina in 2024, the communities that were washed away, the roads that were cut off for weeks, the lives that were ended not on the coast but hundreds of miles inland by flooding that nobody had predicted with confidence, are already fading from the public imagination. and yet the conditions that produced Helene are still present. They are, in the Gulf of Mexico right now, arguably more intense than they were in September 2024. I want to encourage anyone watching this to go directly to the sources. NOAA publishes its tropical weather outlooks daily at their website, and the National Hurricane Center provides real-time tracking and analysis that is accessible to everyone. Colorado State University's seasonal forecast documents are publicly available and written to be understood by a general audience. The USDA's agricultural reports, the congressional records on FEMA staffing, the research published by Yale Climate Connections on Gulf temperatures, all of this is available to anyone who wants to verify what is described in this video. The picture that emerges from reading those sources directly is consistent with what is presented here, and forming your own view from primary sources is always more valuable than relying on any single channel, including this one. What practical preparation looks like for people living along the Gulf or Atlantic coasts in the coming months involves a few specific concrete steps that emergency managers recommend every year, and that are particularly relevant this season. Know your flood zone. Many communities use a lettered zone system, and whether you're in Zone A or Zone E makes an enormous difference in how quickly an evacuation order would apply to you. Look up your specific address rather than assuming based on your neighborhood, because the zone can change house by house in some areas. Have a plan that does not depend on the grid. In a rapidly intensifying situation, power may go out, cell towers may become overwhelmed, and the window for communication may be shorter than expected. Have a physical plan written down, a meeting point, a route, a destination. Stock supplies early in the season, not when a storm is named, because the experience of watching shelves empty in the hours after a storm is named demonstrates exactly why waiting is costly. And consider the vulnerability of the people around you, the elderly neighbour, the family in the mobile home at the end of the street, the person who does not speak English and may not receive or understand an evacuation order delivered through normal channels. These are the individuals most likely to be left behind, and community awareness is one of the most powerful forms of disaster preparedness that no federal agency can replicate. The broader question of what this season represents in the arc of a changing climate is one that scientists are discussing with increasing candor. 5 of the 10 continental United States landfalling storms since 1950 that strengthened by at least 40 miles per hour in the day before landfall have occurred in the past 9 years alone. That concentration in recent years is not random noise, it is a signal. The Gulf of Mexico has been warming at twice the global rate since 2012. A study published in 2026 suggests that a super El Niño event in 2015 and 2016 may have triggered a persistent regional climate regime shift in the Gulf, fundamentally altering how warm Caribbean water is delivered into the basin and how deep that heat extends. If that analysis is correct, the Gulf is not experiencing temporary elevated temperatures that will eventually return to historical norms. It has shifted into a new state, one in which the conditions that powered Helene and that powered Katrina and that will power whatever storms arrive this season are the baseline rather than the exception. The Atlantic hurricane season officially begins in 3 days. The water is already at near-record warmth. The loop current is already regrowing toward its next eddy release. A tropical disturbance is already developing this week off the southeastern coast. The institutions responsible for forecasting, warning and responding are operating with reduced capacity at exactly the moment when the ocean is operating at near maximum energy. Each of these facts is independently documented, independently verified, and independently significant. Together, they describe a season that demands attention not as a source of fear, but as a call to awareness, preparation, and the kind of informed engagement that can genuinely make the difference between a dangerous situation and a catastrophic one. The story of this hurricane season is not yet written. The El Niño may strengthen quickly and provide more protection than current models suggest. The loop current eddy may form in a location that no major storm crosses. Wind shear may remain elevated through the peak months. These are real possibilities, and the season may indeed be quieter than average in terms of total storm count. But the Gulf does not keep its energy locked away indefinitely, and a quiet season with one catastrophic storm, as 1992 demonstrated, can still erase everything that came before it. The water is warm. The season begins June 1st. What happens next belongs to the months ahead, to the atmosphere, and to how prepared the tens of millions of people living within reach of these coastlines choose to be in the days and weeks before the first named storm of 2026 arrives, thank you for watching Skyspace Lab. If this kind of deeply researched content brings value to you, a like and a subscription makes a real difference for this channel. We are still very new, and every person who joins this community helps us continue bringing you this level of research. Stay informed, stay prepared, and we will see you in the next video.